Leave them
Hold
behind.
on! We're getting
Commander
out!
Daniel Brooks'
Emily,
voice
leave
cut
him!
through
We
the
have to
roar of
go!
rain
No,
as
I
the
won't
last
leave him!
National Guard
Save
truck
yourself,
lurched to a
nurse.
stop
We're almost
before the
there.
shattered bridge.
Hold on!
Beyond the torrent, an old brick nursing home stood alone on a shrinking island of mud and floodwater, its lower windows already swallowed by the current. Inside, 43 elderly veterans waited in wheelchairs and hospital beds while the building groaned beneath the pressure of the rising river. Every rescue specialist around Brooks understood the same brutal calculation. The bridge was gone. The water was climbing by the minute. Sending another team across could cost even more lives. Then one quiet voice answered from behind him. No. Brooks turned sharply. Claire Weston stood in soaked blue scrubs, rain dripping from loose strands of chestnut hair, as if she had stepped straight out of the storm itself. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't arguing. She simply walked past armed soldiers carrying only a trauma backpack and a folded evacuation chart tucked beneath one arm. You don't understand, Brooks barked, stepping into her path. That structure won't hold. Claire met his eyes only long enough to say, those men survived wars. I'm not leaving them to drown. Before anyone could stop her, she climbed over twisted guardrails where the bridge had once stood and disappeared onto the narrow maintenance catwalk, still clinging to one side of the collapsed span. Metal screamed beneath her boots. Floodwater crashed only feet below. Several guardsmen instinctively reached forward, expecting the walkway to give way, but Claire never hesitated. She moved with deliberate balance, testing each step before shifting her weight, reading the damaged steel the way experienced climbers' red rock faces. Halfway across, one support cable snapped with a deafening crack. The catwalk lurched violently. Every soldier froze. Claire dropped instantly to one knee, distributing her weight before the movement could throw her into the river. She waited exactly 2 heartbeats, watched the vibration settle, then continued without looking back. Commander Brooks lowered the binoculars from his face. Something about that reaction bothered him. Civilians didn't move like that. The nursing home's emergency doors burst open as Claire reached the entrance. Panicked aides rushed toward her, voices overlapping with fear. Backup generators had failed. Oxygen reserves were running low. 2 residents depended on powered ventilators. Another had collapsed trying to help others upstairs. Claire didn't waste a second asking questions she could answer herself. Her eyes swept across the lobby once, counting wheelchairs, oxygen cylinders, battery lanterns, staircases, and staff members in less time than most people took to introduce themselves. Bring every portable oxygen tank to the dining hall, she said calmly. Move everyone away from the east wing. It's taking the pressure first. Fill every clean container with drinking water before the pipes fail. Nobody challenged her. There was something in the precision of her voice that made frightened people move before fear had time to argue. Outside, Brooks watched through sheets of rain as windows lit briefly with flashlights moving from room to room in organized patterns instead of chaos. His rescue sergeant frowned. Sir, whoever that nurse is, she's establishing triage sectors. Brooks glanced sideways. You sure? Positive. Color priority. Resource rotation. That's not standard nursing home procedure. Brooks looked back toward the building just as another section of riverbank disappeared beneath the flood, sending an entire oak tree crashing into the current. The impact slammed against the foundation, and the whole nursing home shuddered hard enough for every window to rattle. A terrified aide stumbled outside, waving both arms. The basement wall is cracking, she screamed. Brooks clenched his jaw. The building had just lost whatever time he thought remained. Across the river, Claire turned toward the trembling hallway, tightened the straps on her medical pack, and walked deeper into the dark as the lights flickered one final time before the entire nursing home vanished into blackout. Darkness swallowed the nursing home so completely that even the emergency exit signs disappeared beneath the sound of pounding rain. For one suspended second, frightened voices echoed through the hallways. Then Claire's flashlight snapped on, its narrow beam cutting through the black like a lifeline. Nobody moves until I tell you, she said, not loudly, but with the kind of certainty that immediately slowed panicked breathing. Nurses stopped reaching in different directions. Nursing assistants froze beside hospital beds. The confusion that had threatened to become chaos stalled just long enough for Claire to seize it. Battery lanterns to the dining hall. Wheelchairs stay together. Ventilator patients first. We move by teams, never alone. Within moments, people who had been running blindly now had clear assignments. Outside, Commander Brooks watched another transformer explode somewhere beyond the flooded valley, leaving the entire hillside buried beneath storm clouds and darkness. Radio static hissed through every frequency. Helicopters reported visibility too poor to attempt a landing. His operations officer lowered the headset slowly. "Sir, we may not get aircraft in before daylight." Brooks looked across the rushing water toward the barely visible building. Daylight was still hours away. Inside, Claire reached the first ventilator patient. The portable battery indicator flashed less than 30 minutes remaining. A young aide whispered nervously, "We have 2 backup units." Claire glanced toward the flooded hallway where extension cords floated across the floor. "Save those for the next patients. Disconnect the television batteries from every room." They used the same 12-volt system. The aide blinked in disbelief. Will that even work? Claire was already kneeling beside the power connectors. It will keep him breathing longer than doing nothing. Minutes later, improvised cables stretched across the hallway as oxygen continued flowing. One elderly veteran squeezed Claire's wrist with trembling fingers. "You have done this before." She offered only a reassuring smile before moving to the next room. Upstairs, another nurse hurried toward her. "Room 12 refuses to evacuate. He says he survived Korea, and he is not leaving his wife behind." Claire entered the room without hesitation. An elderly man sat beside his wife's bed, gripping her hand while rain hammered against cracked windows. "Sir," Claire said quietly, kneeling until they were eye level. "If you stay here, she loses her chance to survive. Help me move her, and you stay beside her the entire time." The veteran searched her face for several silent seconds before nodding once. Together, they transferred his wife safely into a wheelchair. Watching from the doorway, the younger nurse whispered to herself, "I have never seen anyone calm people that fast." The growing convoy of wheelchairs finally reached the dining hall, just as a deep crack echoed beneath the floor. Every head turned. Ceiling dust drifted through flashlight beams. Water burst from beneath one wall in a narrow stream before spreading across the tile. Someone gasped, "The basement is giving way." Several staff members instinctively started pushing wheelchairs toward the front entrance. Claire stepped directly into their path. "Stop." One orderly shook his head. "The front doors are closest." Claire pointed toward the windows where muddy water slammed against the entrance steps. "Open those doors now, and the current comes inside. We lose the lobby in seconds." The orderly hesitated, unconvinced. Another violent impact shook the building before everyone watched the front doors bow inward under the pressure of floodwater. Silence swept through the room. Without another word, the orderlies turned their wheelchairs toward Claire's alternate route. Outside, Brooks lowered his binoculars. Through broken windows, he could barely make out groups moving steadily instead of scattering. His rescue sergeant frowned again. "Sir, whoever is organizing them just prevented a fatal evacuation route." Brooks did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on the dim flashlight weaving through the darkness with deliberate purpose. Then another transmission burst through the radio. "Commander, updated flood model just arrived. The hillside behind the nursing home is becoming unstable." Brooks grabbed the microphone. "How unstable?" Static crackled before the reply finally came. "If that slope gives way, the entire building could be buried within minutes." The warning reached Claire seconds after Commander Brooks heard it. One of the maintenance workers stumbled into the dining hall, soaked to the bone and barely able to catch his breath. "The hill behind us, the retaining wall, is splitting." Every face turned toward the rear windows. Even through the darkness they could hear it now, a deep, grinding sound beneath the relentless rain, as if the mountain itself had begun to move. Several staff members rushed toward the hallway leading to the front entrance again. "We have to get outside before the hillside comes down." Claire stepped between them and the corridor without raising her voice. "If the slope fails, the safest place is not outside. It is away from the exterior walls." One orderly stared at her in disbelief. How could staying inside possibly be safer? Claire looked upward instead of answering. Tiny flakes of plaster drifted from one corner of the ceiling while the central support beams remained steady. She pointed toward the interior recreation room built decades earlier as a reinforced storm shelter. That room has fewer windows, shorter roof spans, and stronger load-bearing columns. Move everyone there now. No one moved at first. The suggestion sounded completely backward. Then another crack echoed through the building. This time the rear hallway windows shattered under the force of debris striking the outside wall. Cold rain blasted into the corridor exactly where several employees had planned to run. Their hesitation vanished instantly. Wheelchairs turned toward the recreation room while Claire organized the movement in pairs, placing the strongest staff members beside the heaviest residents and assigning others to carry emergency oxygen. Commander Brooks watched through binoculars as lights shifted deeper into the building instead of toward the exits. "What are they doing?" one guardsman asked. Brooks frowned. "I do not know," but she changed direction before the wall failed. Seconds later, part of the rear retaining wall finally collapsed, sending mud and floodwater crashing against the outside of the nursing home. The impact shook the building hard enough to rattle every remaining window, but the interior shelter held. Brooks lowered his binoculars slowly. Had those residents stayed in the rear hallway another 30 seconds, several would have been trapped by the collapse. Inside the recreation room, frightened breathing gradually settled into exhausted silence. Claire moved from resident to resident with quiet efficiency, checking oxygen flow, skin color, pulse, and body temperature before stopping beside an elderly Marine whose hands had begun trembling uncontrollably. Another nurse whispered, "Shock." Claire knelt beside him, wrapped warmed blankets around his shoulders, elevated his feet slightly using folded cushions, and quietly asked another aide to warm intravenous fluids using insulated emergency packs instead of direct heat. The trembling eased within minutes. "How did you know that would work?" the younger nurse asked softly. Claire simply adjusted the old veteran's blanket and continued walking. She never looked back. Across the room, one retired Army sergeant watched her every movement without speaking. His weathered eyes narrowed each time she gave an instruction. She counted supplies without writing anything down. She repositioned wheelchairs so nobody blocked evacuation lanes. She even arranged flashlights so every beam overlapped without wasting batteries. The old soldier finally murmured almost to himself, "That is not how hospital people usually think." Nobody answered him, but two nearby aides exchanged uncertain glances. Outside, Brooks received another report. Engineers estimated the bridge could not be replaced before sunrise, and flood levels were still climbing. Every available rescue route remained cut off. For the first time since arriving, Brooks stopped arguing with Claire in his own mind and started wondering how she kept seeing dangers before everyone else did. Then his radio operator looked up sharply. "Commander, thermal imaging just detected movement beneath the nursing home." Brooks grabbed the monitor. The heat signature was spreading beneath the foundation instead of inside the building. Water had carved a growing cavity under the structure itself. If the erosion continued, the entire nursing home could lose its footing long before the flood ever reached the roof. Commander Brooks stared at the thermal display as the glowing void beneath the nursing home's foundation spread another 6 feet across the screen. The engineer beside him did not soften the conclusion. If that erosion reaches the center support line, the structure will settle unevenly. Even if the walls stay standing, the floors may not. Brooks grabbed the radio immediately. "Claire, listen carefully. We are detecting washout beneath the building. You have to move everyone again." Static swallowed several words before her calm voice returned. "Understood." There was no hesitation, no wasted question, only the sound of footsteps already changing direction. Inside the recreation room, Claire looked once across the crowded shelter before shifting her attention to the building itself instead of the frightened faces around her. She closed her eyes for barely a second as another vibration rolled beneath the floor. Rather than following the loudest noises, she watched a hanging exit sign sway in an uneven rhythm. Then her flashlight dropped to the polished floor where a thin line of muddy water crept beneath one support column, while another remained completely dry. "Everyone moves toward the west corridor," she said quietly. A maintenance supervisor frowned. "The crack is under the east side." Claire nodded without slowing. "Which means the load is shifting away from it. If the floor settles, the center hallway becomes the trap." The supervisor looked uncertain, but one glance at the spreading water convinced him to wave everyone forward. Wheelchairs rolled again before the building had time to make the decision for them. Seconds after the last resident crossed the central hallway, a loud groan echoed through the structure, and several ceiling tiles crashed harmlessly onto the empty floor they had just abandoned. Every staff member stopped moving long enough to look back in stunned silence. Nobody said Claire had been right. They simply began following her next instruction without asking why. As the procession continued, one oxygen cylinder slipped from a transport cart and rolled across the hallway toward a stairwell. A young aide lunged after it instinctively. Claire caught the back of his jacket before he reached the cylinder. Wait! She crouched instead, studying the floor with the flashlight. Fine cracks radiated outward beneath the polished surface, almost invisible beneath the muddy footprints. She carefully extended a folded blanket, pulled the cylinder back inch by inch, and only then allowed the aide to retrieve it. Moments later, part of the weakened flooring near the stairwell sagged several inches under its own weight. The young aide swallowed hard. I never even saw those cracks. Claire simply handed him the oxygen tank and continued walking. The elderly army sergeant who had watched her earlier never took his eyes off her hands. They never shook. They never rushed. Even when the building complained around them, she touched every wall, every handrail, every doorway as though quietly collecting information no one else noticed. He tilted his head, studying the pattern rather than the woman herself. She keeps reading the building, he murmured almost inaudibly. Not reacting to it, reading it. Nearby, another nurse glanced at Claire with growing uncertainty. She had worked emergency medicine for 12 years and had never seen anyone assess structural movement while simultaneously managing medical priorities with such effortless rhythm. No one voiced the same question aloud, yet it settled over the room all the same. Who learns to think this way before anyone else even recognizes the danger? Outside, Brooks received another update that erased what little hope remained. Engineers estimated rescue boats could not safely reach the nursing home while debris continued racing through the flood channel. Helicopters remained grounded by violent crosswinds. There would be no outside extraction for hours. He looked across the river just as Claire's flashlight disappeared around another corner with all 43 veterans still moving behind her in disciplined silence. Then the radio crackled with a new report that changed everything once again. Commander, we have another problem. The west corridor she is moving toward has just been cut off by rising water. She is about to run out of safe routes entirely. The warning reached Claire before anyone else inside understood what it meant. One of the nursing assistants splashed through ankle-deep water from the western corridor, breathing hard. It is flooding fast. We cannot get through anymore. For the first time since the blackout, every planned evacuation route inside the building had vanished. 43 elderly veterans, dozens of oxygen cylinders, and an exhausted medical staff now stood inside a structure, slowly losing the ground beneath it. Several employees looked instinctively toward Claire, waiting for an answer she did not yet have. She studied the ceiling instead of the hallway. Rain hammered the roof in uneven bursts. Wind pushed against one side of the building before falling strangely quiet for several seconds. Her flashlight swept across an old framed blueprint hanging beside the administrator's office, faded beneath decades of dust. She stepped closer, brushed away the grime with one sleeve, and traced one forgotten line with her finger. There is another way. The maintenance supervisor stared at the drawing in disbelief. That service passage was sealed years ago. Claire nodded once. Sealed is not the same as collapsed. She immediately redirected the strongest staff members toward a locked maintenance door hidden behind storage shelves. They cleared the entrance while she checked the floor for signs of movement before allowing anyone closer. The old steel lock resisted at first, then finally gave way. Cold air drifted through the narrow passage beyond. It was cramped, dark, and untouched for years, but the concrete walls showed fewer stress fractures than the hallways they had just abandoned. The consequence was immediate. Instead of waiting helplessly for outside rescue, the nursing home had regained one possible escape route deeper inside the structure. Hope returned, but only in measured doses. The tunnel was barely wide enough for wheelchairs, and every trip would take precious minutes the building might not have. Claire did not celebrate. She simply reorganized everyone into smaller teams, assigning one staff member to every 2 residents. While carefully staggering oxygen supplies so no patient would lose support during the slow movement. Watching from outside through thermal imaging, Commander Brooks frowned as the heat signatures unexpectedly shifted again. They are moving underground, his operations officer said. Brooks looked confused. There should not be any underground access on the current plans. The engineer shook his head. There is not. At least not on any map we received. Brooks said nothing. The woman he had dismissed as an ordinary nurse had now found a route his own response team did not know existed. Back inside, the convoy advanced carefully through the service passage. Claire remained at the rear instead of leading from the front, constantly checking every resident before moving the next group. When one elderly Air Force veteran suddenly became short of breath halfway through the tunnel, she immediately halted the entire line instead of forcing everyone forward. One aide whispered anxiously, "If we stop now, we lose time." Claire calmly exchanged the nearly empty oxygen cylinder with one carried farther back in the rotation, adjusted the flow rate after reassessing the veteran's breathing, then signaled the line to continue. The pause lasted less than a minute, but the veteran's breathing gradually steadied instead of deteriorating. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. Yet every person in the tunnel understood why she had stopped. Moments later, the old Army sergeant quietly watched Claire switch positions with another exhausted aide without being asked, lifting the heavier end of a wheelchair over uneven concrete while conserving everyone else's strength. He studied the rhythm of her decisions more than the decisions themselves. "She never wastes movement," he murmured. "Everything she does protects the next step." The younger nurse beside him slowly nodded, no longer questioning Claire's instructions before carrying them out. Their trust had not come from explanations. It had come from survival. Outside, Brooks lowered the thermal monitor as another report arrived. Engineers had just confirmed that the underground erosion was accelerating far faster than expected. The hidden service passage Claire had discovered was no longer simply an escape route. It now ran directly across the section of ground most likely to fail first. Brooks grabbed the radio instantly. "Claire, listen to me. You have to get everyone out of that tunnel now." Static swallowed the first half of her reply, but the final words came through with chilling clarity. "Commander, we cannot turn back anymore." Claire tightened her grip on the rear wheelchair as Commander Brooks' warning echoed through the radio. Turning back was impossible. The narrow service tunnel behind them had already begun taking on water, while 43 elderly veterans filled nearly every foot of the confined passage ahead. "Keep moving," Claire said calmly. "Nobody rushes. Nobody stops unless I say so." Her voice carried steadily through the concrete corridor, replacing panic with rhythm. One wheelchair rolled, then another. Oxygen cylinders passed carefully from hand to hand. Every movement depended on the one before it. The tunnel had become less an escape route than a living chain of trust, and breaking that chain would endanger everyone behind it. 50 yards ahead, the passage narrowed where decades of settling had shifted the concrete walls inward. A powered wheelchair could no longer fit through the opening. The line halted instantly. Staff members exchanged frightened looks as precious seconds slipped away. Claire crouched beside the chair instead of forcing it through. She removed the detachable battery pack, folded the footrests inward, lowered the seat several inches, then quietly directed 4 volunteers to lift only on her count, while another stabilized the oxygen tubing. One step. Stop. Breathe. Again. The wheelchair cleared the obstruction without tipping or disconnecting the patient's oxygen. As the convoy resumed moving, one young aide stared after Claire in disbelief. She solved that faster than anyone even understood the problem. Nobody answered him because another challenge had already appeared. An elderly Navy veteran suddenly reached for Claire's sleeve before she could continue forward. His weathered eyes rested on the way she instinctively checked every doorway before leading people through it. "You always look high before you look ahead," he whispered. Claire paused only briefly. "Old habit." The veteran gave the faintest smile. "Not a hospital habit." She gently adjusted his blanket instead of replying and signaled the next team to move. The words lingered behind her long after she had disappeared deeper into the tunnel. Commander Brooks listened to fragmented radio updates while engineers continued monitoring the foundation. Every report sounded worse than the last, yet the nursing home's internal movement remained remarkably organized. One communications specialist looked up from intercepted transmissions coming from portable radios inside the building. "Sir, whoever is directing them is spacing oxygen usage, assigning movement intervals, and rotating personnel before fatigue becomes visible." Brooks remained silent. None of those instructions had been requested from outside. They were being anticipated from within. He looked across the flooded valley and quietly admitted to himself something he would never have believed an hour earlier. The survival of everyone inside now depended less on his rescue operation than on the judgment of the nurse he had ordered to leave behind. Far inside the passage, the convoy finally reached an abandoned maintenance chamber where the concrete floor remained stable enough to rest the residents briefly. Claire immediately refused the only folding chair someone offered her and instead moved through the room, checking every veteran one more time. She noticed dry lips before dehydration became serious, adjusted blankets before body temperatures dropped further, and quietly redistributed the remaining medical supplies without leaving any patient completely dependent on a single oxygen source. Watching her, the elderly army sergeant slowly reached into his jacket and removed an old challenge coin worn smooth by decades of use. He studied it for a long moment before looking back toward Claire. "The last medic I ever saw think this far ahead," he said softly to no one in particular. "Promised us nobody gets left behind." He slipped the coin back into his pocket before anyone could ask another question. Claire never heard him. She was already kneeling beside another resident whose breathing had begun slowing again. As she reached into her trauma pack for fresh tubing, something small slid from an inner compartment onto the concrete floor. It landed face down beside her boot before anyone noticed. Then the army sergeant quietly bent to pick it up, turned it over beneath his flashlight, and his expression changed completely as he stared at the faded military insignia engraved into the worn metal. The faded metal insignia had barely touched the army sergeant's hand when the tunnel shook with a low, rolling vibration. Dust drifted from the concrete ceiling. Someone shouted that the floor behind them was beginning to sink. Claire reacted before anyone else could freeze. "Forget the equipment. Keep the oxygen. Move the residents." She slipped the insignia back into her trauma pack without looking at it, stepped to the front of the convoy, and redirected everyone through the narrowest section of the passage. 2 wheelchairs became wedged side by side, where broken conduit had collapsed across the floor. Rather than forcing them through, Claire immediately ordered the stronger staff members to transfer both veterans into evacuation litters assembled from folded blankets and maintenance poles stored against the tunnel wall. The wheelchairs were left behind. Within moments the blockage cleared, the line began moving again, and only seconds later the abandoned chairs disappeared beneath a surge of muddy water pouring through the tunnel behind them. The choice had saved the evacuation, but it left Claire carrying the heaviest litter herself as the confined passage continued trembling beneath every step. When the last patient reached the farm maintenance exit, fresh air rushed into the tunnel for the first time in hours. Commander Brooks and a small National Guard team had finally reached the opposite side using an emergency utility access road opened by heavy equipment. Brooks stepped forward automatically to take the front handles from Claire, but before either of them spoke, the elderly army sergeant quietly held up the weathered insignia he had managed to return to her pack during the transfer. Mud had been wiped from its surface just enough to reveal an old combat medic crest worn smooth by years of service. The sergeant looked from the insignia to Claire and then toward Brooks. "I knew I had seen those hands before," he said softly. "Not her face. Her hands. She checks corners before entering. She counts people before equipment. She rotates supplies before anyone asks. Combat medics do that because they have learned what happens when they do not." Brooks stared at Claire in stunned silence. Nobody had announced her past. Nobody had opened a personnel file. Nothing new had been invented. Every strange decision she had made since the bridge collapsed suddenly fit together with perfect clarity. One of Brooks' senior rangers, who had just helped secure the exit, glanced at the insignia only briefly before instinctively straightening his posture. "Sir," he said quietly, "that crest belonged to Special Forces medical instructors years ago." He offered nothing more. He did not explain missions, units, or records. He simply recognized what everyone else had already witnessed with their own eyes. Claire barely acknowledged the conversation. Her attention remained fixed on the 43 veterans still waiting to be moved beyond the unstable ground. "We are not finished," she said, already checking oxygen levels again. "The foundation is still moving." Without another word, she organized the final transfer across the muddy access road. placing the most fragile residents into the first rescue vehicles while directing ambulatory veterans to walk only where the engineers had marked safe footing. Brooks did not question a single instruction. For the first time that night, National Guard soldiers followed Claire's sequence without hesitation because every earlier decision had already earned their trust. As the final stretcher crossed onto solid ground, the nursing home behind them settled with a long, exhausted groan, sending a cloud of dust and rain into the storm-dark sky. No one cheered. They simply stood in silence, watching the building they had escaped only minutes before. Then one frail veteran reached out from his blanket, gently took Claire's hand, and smiled through tired eyes. "You kept your promise," he whispered. Claire looked at him with the same quiet composure she had carried all night. "No," she answered softly. "You kept yours first." Around them, soldiers lowered their heads in quiet respect. Commander Brooks removed his rain-soaked cap for a brief moment, not because of her insignia, but because he had witnessed every decision that led to this one. Before anyone could speak again, an engineer hurried toward the group with fresh urgency. "Commander," he called, "we have everyone accounted for, except one staff member. The head count is short by one." The engineer's report spread through the rescue teams in seconds. 43 veterans had been evacuated. Every resident had been accounted for. But one member of the nursing home staff was still missing. Before Commander Brooks could issue another order, Claire had already turned toward the battered building. Brooks stepped in front of her for the first time that night, not to stop her out of doubt, but out of concern. "You have done enough." Claire met his eyes with the same quiet expression she had carried since the bridge collapsed. "One person is still inside." She accepted a fresh flashlight from a young guardsman, checked its battery without a word, and headed back toward the damaged maintenance entrance, while two engineers quickly confirmed the safest remaining approach. Nobody argued. This time, several National Guard soldiers simply fell in behind her without being asked. Inside the silent building, the storm no longer sounded like chaos. It sounded distant, almost tired. Ceiling panels hung loose. Water dripped steadily through cracked pipes. Claire paused every few steps, listening more than looking. Then she changed direction unexpectedly and entered the old medication storage room, instead of continuing toward the administrative offices. One guardsman looked puzzled until a faint tapping echoed through the wall. Hidden beneath a collapsed shelving unit, the missing administrator had become trapped while trying to retrieve emergency records before the evacuation. Claire immediately directed everyone to lift only the unstable shelving while leaving the surrounding supports untouched. Within moments, the exhausted woman was safely guided free. No celebration followed. Claire simply wrapped a dry blanket around her shoulders and quietly walked beside her all the way back outside. As the final head count was completed, an unexpected calm settled over the flooded valley. Rain softened into a steady drizzle. Dawn slowly pushed pale light across the clouds. Ambulance crews continued checking residents while National Guard soldiers unloaded warm blankets, coffee, and portable heaters. Commander Brooks noticed something that surprised him more than anything that had happened during the night. Every soldier who passed Claire instinctively slowed down. Some nodded. Others quietly stepped aside to give her space. None of them did it because of the insignia they had briefly seen. They did it because every one of them had watched her place other lives before her own from the very first moment she crossed the broken bridge. Nearby, the elderly army sergeant reached into his pocket once again and held out the worn challenge coin he had quietly carried for decades. Claire looked at it, then gently folded his fingers back around it. "Keep it," she said softly. "It has already done its job." The old veteran smiled, understanding without another word. The younger nurse who had questioned Claire's decisions earlier approached, carrying an unopened medical kit. Instead of handing it over, she simply placed it beside Claire and silently began restocking the depleted trauma bag exactly the way she had watched Claire organize it throughout the night. She never asked how. She simply copied what experience had already taught her to respect. A few feet away, Commander Brooks looked toward the shattered bridge where the night had begun with an order he now wished he had never spoken. He removed his gloves, walked over to Claire, and without making a speech, extended the folded evacuation chart she had dropped hours earlier in the rain. It had been carefully dried and smoothed as much as possible. Claire accepted it with a quiet nod before immediately using the back of the paper to update. medication notes for one of the veterans waiting for transport. Even now, recognition changed nothing about the work that still needed to be done. As the first ambulance prepared to leave, the elderly Marine whose breathing Claire had stabilized reached through the open door and gently raised 2 fingers in a simple farewell. One after another, the other veterans answered with the same quiet gesture until nearly every ambulance carried the silent salute down the mountain road. Claire stood in the morning light watching them disappear, her rain-soaked scrubs still stained with mud, the folded evacuation chart resting beneath one arm exactly as it had when she first crossed the broken bridge. She had refused to leave them behind, and now, as the last vehicle disappeared beyond the hill, it was clear that none of them had left her behind either. By mid-morning, the floodwater had finally begun to retreat, leaving behind broken branches, twisted guardrails, and a nursing home that would never welcome another resident again. Yet the parking lot, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now carried a different kind of quiet. Ambulances came and went without urgency. Families embraced the veterans they had feared they would never see again. National Guard engineers folded their maps with slower hands than they had used through the night. No one needed to ask who had made the difference. They had all watched it happen, one careful decision at a time. Claire Weston never stepped into the center of those reunions. While cameras from the local emergency management office documented structural damage, she quietly walked from stretcher to stretcher checking medication lists one final time, making certain every transfer sheet matched every patient. She corrected a dosage time on one chart, tucked an extra blanket around another veteran whose hands still felt cold, and thanked a young paramedic for catching an allergy bracelet before transport. None of those small moments would ever appear in an official report, but together they reflected the same quiet discipline that had carried 43 veterans safely through the longest night of their lives. Nearby, the younger nurse who had once questioned nearly every instruction found herself stopping before entering each ambulance, instinctively scanning the surroundings the way Claire had done all night. She counted patients before supplies. She checked exits before walking through them. She noticed herself doing it only after the 3rd ambulance departed, and a small smile crossed her face. Nothing had been taught in a classroom. Everything had been learned by watching someone refuse to panic. Commander Brooks stood near the remains of the bridge where the entire night had begun with an order he could never take back. Rescue crews had already started placing temporary survey markers for a replacement crossing. Brooks quietly removed the waterproof command board from beneath his arm, looked once toward the empty riverbank, then wrote a single line beneath the incident summary before handing it to his operations officer. No speeches followed. No ceremony interrupted the morning. The officer simply read the note, nodded once, and filed it with the official rescue record. A few yards away, the elderly Army sergeant slowly walked toward Claire carrying the challenge coin he had tried to return before. This time he did not offer it to her. Instead, he handed it to the young nurse who had worked beside Claire through the storm. "Keep people moving," he said gently. The way she did. The younger nurse accepted it with both hands, glancing toward Claire before quietly slipping it into her pocket. Claire never noticed. She had already climbed into the last ambulance to retrieve a forgotten pair of reading glasses for one of the veterans. When she stepped back onto the pavement, the old Marine who had first squeezed her wrist during the blackout looked through the ambulance window with tired but peaceful eyes. "See you tomorrow, nurse?" he asked. Claire smiled exactly as she had the first time she entered the flooded building. "If you need me." The ambulance door closed softly, and the vehicle rolled away down the mountain road beneath clearing skies. One by one, the remaining rescue trucks followed. The noise of engines gradually faded until only birds and distant water remained. Claire looked once at the broken bridge where she had quietly answered one impossible order with a single word. Then she adjusted the familiar trauma backpack across her shoulder, folded the weathered evacuation chart beneath her arm exactly as she had at the beginning of the night, and started walking toward the temporary medical station where new patients were already arriving. No applause followed her. No one called her name. She simply disappeared into the next task waiting to be done, leaving behind something stronger than a dramatic victory. Long after the floodwaters receded and the bridge was rebuilt, the people who had stood on that riverbank would remember that the most powerful answer they heard all night was not shouted across the storm. It was spoken quietly by a nurse who looked at 43 forgotten veterans, and simply said, "No."